presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Jawad, and thank you for inviting me for this occasion. I think you have come on an evening to listen to four of us, and this is a difficult subject, but I'll try and make it accessible as much as I can. I apologize for not speaking in French. My spoken French is not good enough, so I'm forced to speak to you in English, which is a pity. I was asked by Jawad to start on a personal note. I have not done this before but once. Last year in the IHRC meeting in London. And this is not easy for me and probably for others, but I understand that this was, the request. Now, my parents both came from a small town in southern Poland called Ostrowiec. It's actually just between Krakow and Auschwitz. It's exactly in the middle between those two places. Like other Jews in Poland, in 1940, a ghetto was organized for the Jews of the town, and they were there until 1944. When I was a child, my father said that in comparison to the ghetto, Auschwitz was like a holiday camp. Now, you can imagine that Auschwitz was not a holiday camp, but the ghetto was much worse. I'm saying this because I remember Gaza. And think about Gaza when you hear the word ghetto. I'll come back to this later on. Life in the ghetto was so bad that half the Jews incarcerated in that ghetto, and that is a very typical number, have perished without gas chambers, without shooting. They died from starvation, they died from diseases that could not be treated, they died because there was nothing, nobody, no organization looking after them. Now, in 1943, there were what the Nazis called Akcja, actions, and the families, both of my father and my mother, were taken to Treblinka and destroyed there. They are the only people who survived from their families. Both families were about 120 people that were destroyed in Treblinka. Of course, people in the ghetto worked for the Nazis, for the war industries of the Third Reich. And they died mainly because they were not fed. They worked very hard, but they were not fed even for people who don't work. So that has brought the high death toll before even anybody was taken to the camps. On June 1944, the very few Jews, few hundred that were left in the ghetto, were taken to Auschwitz. Now, Auschwitz is 15 kilometers from the town, but it took 3 days for them to arrive there because those trains had to all the time give way to army trains. So by the time they got to Auschwitz, 30% of the people were already dead. And the first thing that they had to do is pull the dead out of the trains. You have seen films and read about this, and this is not news to anybody. While they were in Auschwitz, they were in a camp called Treblinka, which is the death camp. Auschwitz actually was not a death camp, though many people died there. It was a camp for workers. But beside the small camp for workers was a very large camp called Treblinka, in which 250,000 people lived and died at any point in time. Of course, overall, about 2 million people were murdered there, but at any point in time there was up to 250,000 people waiting to be killed. And why they were waiting to be killed, they worked. My father worked for a firm called Messerschmitt, which produced aeroplanes, and they tried to derail the production, and as a result, because they didn't know who tried to derail the production, they shot about 80% of the workers. My father was only whipped. He got 50 lashes of the whip. But many of the others were just killed because they didn't know who did the sabotage on the production line. When the Russians were across the river from Auschwitz, the Nazis came to the last point in the 8th phase process that was described so accurately before. And that phase is denial. So in order to make sure that it's not possible to prove that anyone was killed in Auschwitz, they took both the men and the women and marched them on foot to, the women were marched to Bergen-Belsen, which was a concentration camp in Germany. My mother marched there. 80% of the women died on the road. She arrived to Bergen-Belsen half dead, and when the British in 1945 came to free Bergen-Belsen, she was 32 kilos, like all the people there. Imagine a grown woman who is 32 kilos, and she had typhoid, and they put her and many other people with typhoid aside because there was no way of saving them, and somehow one of the women doctors thought that they can save her, and they did. Nobody was actually gassed in Bergen-Belsen because it was a concentration camp rather than a death camp. But at that point, the Germans left the camp well before the British came. There was no food, there was no medicine, there was no water, and people died like flies. And actually, what happened is that more people died after the British came because they gave people food, and they were not used to eat proper food for years. So when they ate cans of meat, they died. My mother didn't die because she couldn't eat. She had typhoid, so she was surviving because of that. My father was, there were 6,000 men left in the camp. On the 15th of January, like the women, they started walking towards Austria and came to a camp which is called Gusen, which the Nazis thought was the worst camp that they have ever built, and they called it in German the Hell of Hells, and indeed it was. And what they did there is in the mountains. It's a very beautiful place, by the way. It's by a lake. Today there is lots of hotels there, and there is a little remnant of the camp which I filmed in last year. And what they did there is move the V2 rocket production from Swinemünde in Northern Europe because the British have bombed Swinemunde, they moved the V2 production in 1944 to Gusen in Austria, and had 15 tunnels dug into the mountain, each of them a kilometer long. And those tunnels were the production place of the V2. It was too small for animals to, and they didn't have animals to carry the trucks. So basically they used humans as mules, as, you know, they used them as animals. And they were, you will see the picture in a minute, they tied them to the trucks and they carried the trucks up and down all day. I think this is a picture from the 8th of May, 1945. It's the last day of the war, or the first day of peace. And this is the day the Americans have freed Gusen. And you can see it's saying that below. Actually, the place where Gusen is called Ebensee. Ebensee is the name of the lake. And this was shot by the American forces. They had the special unit that shot this. And the person that I'm pointing to with the pointer is my father. We didn't know that he never saw this picture. He died many years ago. He never saw this picture, and in a way, I'm happy that he didn't see it. The Gusen was a sub-camp of Mauthausen, and my sister went to Mauthausen 5 years ago, and this is the first picture as you come into the camp, into the museum. And all of a sudden, she saw her father on the wall. And this is he. This is, and there is another picture in which he is, and this is he. And you can see he was 30 kilos and when they weighed him on the Liberation Day. I'm not happy showing those pictures, but I think, you know, because I was asked, I share it with you, and I want to now say why I'm showing it to you. And this is the section that I call From the Holocaust to the Nakba. There can be only two ways to react to the Holocaust. One is the way Zionism has reacted to it, and that is, this will never happen again to Jews, so we will kill people first before they kill us. This is the first way to react to the Holocaust. This is a totally wrong way, of course. The second way, which we heard before about from both speakers, is that what happened to the Jews should never happen to anyone. This is a problem of all humanity. The Holocaust does not belong to Jews. It does not belong to Israel that uses it and abuses it. And it belongs to humanity. I also want to say that in all serious books on the Holocaust, we learn that the figure of 6 million people who died in the Holocaust is wrong. Does anyone here know how many people died in the Holocaust?
10 to 12 million.
11 million people died in the Holocaust. Half of them were Jewish. So we're only relating to the Jewish people, while we are actually disregarding the 5.5 million people who were mostly Russian prisoners of war that were totally illegally killed, like everyone was illegally killed. But of course, you know, they are protected by international agreements. You cannot kill soldiers that, prisoners of war. It's illegal to kill them. And so basically this is the largest group. The second largest group is Polish citizens and soldiers. And then of course homosexuals, Roma people, trade unionists, communists, etc. So 5.5 million people died who are not being talked about in Europe to this very day. This is a terrible thing. So if everyone mentions the number 6 million, actually there were slightly less than 6 million Jews killed, but 11 million people died in the Holocaust. We should remember every single one of them. Now, I want to talk about what happened to my parents, and by that time I was born. My parents met in a DP camp. They knew each other, they are related. They met in the DP camp in Torino, in Italy, moved to Rome, where I was born about a year after the war, and they refused to go back to Poland. They refused to go back to Poland because at the time that I was born, there were a number of very large killings, murders of groups of Jews in Poland. The most well-known one was in Kielce in 1946. I was born in 1946. And therefore, they did not trust going back to Poland, though they saw themselves as Polish. They tried to get to a number of countries in the West from the DP camp. No country in Europe offered them a place. And in the end, they ended up going to Israel in 1948. So I was not even 2 years when we arrived to Israel. My father refused to join the arms training on the boat. They prepared people for the war, which already started. My father said, after what he has done, he is not going to kill anybody. And they can kill him, but he's not going to kill anybody. So he was one of the first, I don't know if he was the first, but he was one of the first conscientious objectors in 1948. And of course what they did is they put him in jail and tried to break him, and they broke him. After 2 months, we were in a prison camp waiting, my mother and myself, and he agreed to join the forces as long as he's unarmed, as a medic. So he didn't fight, but he saved people, especially in Latrun, which was a very terrible massacre of over 3,000 people. 2,000 of them were Israelis, and over 1,000 were Jordanian legionnaires from the Arab Legion. And basically, most of those 2,000 were Holocaust survivors. Nobody knew their names. They were buried in mass graves because nobody knew their names. They moved us into Jaffa, that was taken with great violence. You know that Jaffa was taken before the end of the mandate, in April 1948, with great violence by the Irgun, the right-wing militia. And most of the people of Jaffa were either killed or forcibly expelled, and they ended up in Jabalia in Gaza. Actually, the name Jabalia is relating to a little town called Jabaliyeh, which is a very beautiful little town south of Jaffa, where we lived. Interestingly, there were Palestinian Arabs that did not run away and did not get killed, and we lived together, and I didn't know there was anything wrong with them until I went to school. Because we played together, we spoke Arabic, we spoke Hebrew, we were children. And my parents, and this is the last of my personal story, my mother, when we came into the place where we lived, which was of course belonging to a Palestinian family that I took many years later, months to find in Gaza, and I did. They went on a boat. The boat turned over, most of the people died, and another boat took them. And one of the children died in that disaster. Many people died in the sea. Now, what happened when we were small is my mother told me, and my sister later on, that at the end of the corridor, all those things that were in the house when we came, she put them together because they don't belong to us, and we were not allowed to go there. Of course, children, of course, the minute that you tell them not to go there, you go there when mother is not at home. And everything that was found in the house, including albums with photographs, which of course is the most important thing that people are looking for in such situations. But everything from the kitchen, everything from the bedroom was piled up very, very neatly. And my mother said, when they come back, this is for them. And we will leave this house when they come back, and they will live in their own house. They, of course, did not come back. And unfortunately, both my father, who was a conscientious objector, and my mother, who I told you about, became typical Israelis after many years. And when I grew up and became an anti-Zionist and an activist for Palestine, they did not understand why I do what I do. And I said to them, I do it because of you. They didn't like that. Now, I want to talk about genocide in general and concentrate on Palestine in the time that is left. Of course, Qasim already talked about a lot of this, so I'm going to be sorry, Razat talked about this, so I'm going to be just talking in very short sentences about that. First of all, let's talk about the first genocide, which is actually mentioned in literature. And that is not a genocide in the 20th century, it's not a genocide in Europe. The first and best recorded genocide is the book of Joshua in the Bible. It's when the people, the Israelites, supposedly coming out of Egypt in the Exodus, killed the 7 people of Palestine. And please, if you don't know the story, read the book of Joshua. And I'll say in a minute why I think you should read it. What is God's command, supposedly? Of course, this is not God's command. This is what people wrote in the book many hundreds of years after the events. What is the command to the Israelites? The book of Joshua is made of 26 chapters. Each chapter is the same. In each chapter, the command is, go into, say, the Jebusites. The Jebusites were a group of people who lived around what is today Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the Jebusite capital. It was called Yerushalem. And the Hebrew word is basically a transliteration of that. Yerushalem became Yerushalayim. But it's not a Jewish city originally. So go into the Jebusite, kill every man, woman, child, every animal, destroy every house. The only animal, interestingly, that was saved from killing were the horses, because they were too valuable, and the horses had to be neutered or emasculated. But everything else had to be destroyed physically. So 26 chapters are saying, go into the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, etc. And basically it's the same chapter 26 times. Everyone had to be killed. The fields had to be destroyed. The houses had to be destroyed. So we have no date for this. And in all probability, it didn't happen like that. This is what historians think. Historians today believe, not just Israeli historians that don't agree with this, but other historians that checked, they think that this is a great exaggeration and there wasn't a total genocide of the people of Palestine. The proof is the rest of the Bible. The rest of the Bible, the Israelites are a small minority in Palestine, and the 7 groups there are mentioned all the time. So if there was an attempt to kill them, it was not successful. But the book of Joshua, everything is successful, and of course the very well-known case is Jericho, where everything was wiped clean. Now, why am I telling you about something that is written about but may not have happened in the way that it is mentioned? Because for Israeli Jews, not only did it happen, but it should have happened in the way that it happened. And this is the main story, which is a foundational basis for Zionism and its thinking about the Palestinians. If you understand that, then you start understanding what Zionism is about. And a lot of the historians, Zionist historians, are negating other historians who are saying, obviously you are wrong. It's not true that you managed to kill all those people, because there is evidence that they existed later on. They fight that and argue that yes, the book of Joshua is very accurate, and all those people were killed. Whichever way you go in your, do you believe those or do you believe the other side? One thing is clear. This is the model of taking a country over and destroying its population, which now we call genocide in 1948. So in 1948, a number of things happened. First of all, Zionism already started genocidal actions before 1948. Between 1936 and 1939, the Palestinians have risen against the British mandate, the British authorities in Palestine. Now, you have to, I don't have time to talk about that, but you have to understand what happened in Palestine. To make most of the British army stationed in Palestine at the time that they had problems in India, which is slightly bigger than Palestine, as you well know. So the two parts of the empire were fighting against Britain at the same time. But most of the army was not in India, it was in Palestine, because the resistance of the Palestinians was so strong that not only was the British army and the British police, especially those from Northern Ireland, who were used to killing Catholics, You know, the British have, as Razas mentioned, a lot of genocides to their records. As they were very good at killing Catholics, they were brought to Palestine to kill Palestinians. And they did. 9,000 Palestinians died in those 3 years. The most important fighters that will not be there when the battle starts in 1947, Palestine is facing the onslaught, the genocidal onslaught of the Jewish forces, without the most important fighters, because they're dead or because they're in prison. So all those British forces were not enough to defeat the Palestinians, and therefore they took about 10,000 Jewish soldiers, drafted them into the British force of as auxiliaries, and they helped the British to suppress the rebellion. So we're talking about 9,000 people killed because they're Palestinians. What are the British doing in Palestine? What did the British do in India? What did the British do all over the world? Yeah, you might well ask. So I want to talk about one thing which is very misunderstood. Yes, I mentioned a genocide that happened some 4,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, and maybe it didn't happen, or maybe it happened but didn't happen in the way that it is described. But in ancient times there were very few genocides. Why genocide people? You know, terrible things happened here. The Roman Empire and other empire would take thousands and tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, and sell them as slaves, because they were able to make money that way. Yeah? So people that you have defeated were sold as slaves. Some of those would fight the gladiators and animals in Rome and die. This was genocide as well, of course. But the idea of destroying a whole people in antiquity is almost unknown. I'm not saying it is unknown, but it's almost unknown. And you can see on my figures here that between 1956, which is, remember, 8 years after genocide was made a crime against humanity, and 2016, there were a total of 43 genocides in which 50 million people died, and maybe another 50 million people perished as well. There are, figures that bring it almost to 100 million people. In other words, genocides are not something that happened all the time and, from antiquity and always, and people killed each other in great numbers. No, it is not. It is a modern event. And, it was mentioned before by Mr. Peterson that, Europe has a lot to answer for, and Christianity has a lot to answer for in terms of genocide, because, Christianity that started as a religion which is actually very weak, and actually it was also Christians that were in the fighting the gladiators in Rome, as you well know, and they were thrown to the lions, as it's called. They ended up as the major activators of genocide in modern times. And when I'm talking about modern times, I'm talking about after 1492, because the first thing that the Reconquista in Spain has caused is mass genocide of Jews and Muslims. And the hatred and Islamophobia towards these two groups, in a sense we should call it Judeophobia and Islamophobia, And I'm not using the term anti-Semitism because I think it is a disgusting term. And I suggest that you shouldn't use it either. And I'll come to that probably later on. But this Judeophobia and Islamophobia is a mark of Europe ever since the end of the 13th century, when the Muslims and Jews of Seville were butchered. So this is rather modern, this is rather recent. And basically, Freud, in his writing, is saying that this type of violence was invented by monotheism. You know, people before monotheism, polytheists, lived and let live. You don't believe in my God? I don't believe in your God? Well, we live together. What difference does it make? This is your God, this is my God. It doesn't matter. This has happened since the beginning of monotheism. You know, Jews killed Christians and Christians killed Jews because of the religion. When Islam is introduced, there are versions later on of Shia and Sunni killing each other. Monotheism is not just a great event, which it is, of course, but it's also the beginning of killing for because you are not my religion. We have to be aware and you have to be open about those things. And if we understand that, we can stop this from happening anymore. Now, I want to end by talking about colonialism. This is why I'm saying since 1492, and this is why I'm saying this is a modern thing. Raza has already mentioned the great genocides of colonialism, so I will not repeat that. And these are very important. Because these are Christian cultures exclusively that are doing the slavery, that are doing the murdering of about 20 to 25 millions of North American indigenous people, and bigger number in South and Central America, and all over the globe, Africa, Australia, and Asia. Of course, India is a massive place where this has happened. These were Christian cultures, and when they take Mexico, which is the first genocide, they are actually saying these people should die because they don't believe in the Christian God. So whoever doesn't believe in the Christian God is not human, and therefore, as Raza mentioned, this is the first and second stage. You know, you have to identify the person as non-human, and therefore they can be killed. They can't. You shouldn't kill humans, but if they're not human, you can kill them. And of course, my parents were not human to the Nazis, and the Palestinians were not human to the Zionist forces, and therefore you can kill those people because they're not humans. Now, I want to mention some of the, the list there is mentioning some of the genocides that haven't been mentioned, because they are exceptions. And sometimes people don't know about the genocide in the Congo, and this is of course a Belgian genocide, which was terrifying in its brutality. But I want to talk for a moment about the genocide of the Armenians and the Kurds by the Ottoman Empire. And this is the exception, because here we have Christians, and the Kurds are not Christians, but the Armenians were Christians, killed by a Muslim power, which really is the first time that this has happened, not in Europe, but not very far from Europe. Why am I talking about this specifically? Because most of them didn't die because they were killed, they died because they were hungry and there was no food, there were no water, it was very hot, they died from diseases, and the Ottomans designed this. It wasn't by chance that this has happened. They designed it in such a way that most of the Armenians will perish in the desert without food, without water, and those that didn't die were killed. So this is the first genocide, well, not the first, but one of the first genocide of the 20th century. And in Turkey, you are not allowed to call it a genocide to this very day. And of course, the genocide of the Kurds, it was smaller, but not nicer, is also one which we should remember. So this is important. Monotheistic people kill other monotheistic people for the same reason they killed them in the past, but now they can kill them in larger numbers. So I want to come to the theoreticians, and Raza has already mentioned this, but I want to talk about Raoul Hilberg and Zygmunt Bauman, and they are both saying, first of all, Raza described very accurately, and thank you for doing that because you saved me time, the 8 steps that are needed in order to kill people. I want to mention why I think this is a problematic analysis. If you're looking for 8 steps and you don't find them, is it not genocide? For example, if you're looking for 8 steps in Biafra or in Rwanda or in Myanmar, you can't find 8 steps. So I don't think that we should take this theory as the be-all and end-all. The 8 steps don't exist in Palestine either. So sometimes there are 8 steps, sometimes there are 6, and sometimes there are 2. Sometimes a state kills people, like in Myanmar. In Rwanda, it wasn't a state. The state got the citizens to kill people who lived next door to them. So, first of all, this means that this is a very complex procedure we are talking about, genocide. 2 genocides are not the same, but they're all genocides. Secondly, you don't need to kill a whole people for it to be called genocide. You don't need to kill millions for it to be called genocide. The Israelis have been killing Palestinians ever since the 30s. Even before they became Israelis. At the time they were still Palestinians themselves. Yeah? That doesn't make it not genocidal. Yeah? Another thing that is genocidal is genocidal expulsions. This, of course, is what happened in Palestine. This, of course, is what happened in Myanmar. This has happened many, many times, of course, also in ex-Yugoslavia, in many places. There was a combination of genocidal killing and genocidal expulsion. Now, why am I calling it genocidal expulsion and not ethnic cleansing? Because like anti-Semitism, which is a term which was invited by anti-Semites, ethnic cleansing is a term of Milosevic and Karadzic, and we shouldn't use it because it is whitewashing genocide by calling it ethnic cleansing. And why? Because genocide is a crime against humanity which the UN has defined in 1948, and you can find yourself in jail, and you can find yourself in court, while ethnic cleansing is not. And therefore, when they brought those ex-Yugoslav war criminals, they couldn't actually judge them because they were ethnic cleansers. They had to judge them according to other crimes. So I think I'm suggesting to you not to use ethnic cleansing, but use the term which is accurate, genocidal expulsions. And it's not just terminology, it's more accurate. And basically, it's a real problem to base, the West is basing all talk of genocide on the Holocaust. Now, The Holocaust is indeed a very large genocide of 11 million people. But all the preparation that the Nazis have done is missing from almost every other genocide. So yes, it's very important in order to understand the Holocaust to discuss the 8 steps. But no, it's not important to find those 8 steps, because sometimes it only takes 3 of them, and before you know it, people are killed. So you don't have the time to wait for all those 8 steps, because it might not happen in that way, and that's very important. Myanmar didn't happen that way. Rwanda didn't happen that way. Even the killing of the Armenians didn't happen that way. Biafra didn't happen that way. So this is very important. For Yemen didn't happen that way. It's very important for us not to be hooked on theoretical structures, but on reality. And in reality, we know what it means. It means killing people because they are who they are. Not because they have done anything. Not because what they have done, not because what they have not done, but because of who they are. When you kill people because of who they are, that's genocide. So, when you kill people in Gaza because they are Palestinians, that's genocide. They didn't do anything. Now, not only that is genocide, but to actually blockade Gaza since 2006 is genocide. This is what the 1948 definition of genocide says. To deny people food, medicine, water, services is genocidal. Now, you probably do know that the UN is saying that the genocide in Gaza is about to start, because what happened until now is small beer. Because by 2020, which lets me remind you is next year, there will not be drinkable water in Gaza. So, why is there not drinkable water in Gaza? Because of what Israel is doing to the aquifer. So the Gazans are now drinking the last of the water of the aquifer, and as someone who's been in Gaza many times, you don't want to drink that water. You really don't want to, but they have no choice. So soon they will not even have that choice, because the aquifer is now full of seawater. So it will not be possible to live in Gaza. I'm just mentioning the water, I'm not mentioning everything else. So according to the UN, that is part of genocide. Also, what is happening now in the United States to people who are of Spanish or Hispanics who come into the country, where children are taken and put into cages, and you've seen that many times, and I'm not talking about 2 or 3 or 10 or 100 children, I'm talking about tens of thousands of children that are there because they are Hispanics. This is actually, in 1948, defined as a genocide crime, to take children from their parents, to separate them, and to incarcerate them. What did those children do? They made one mistake. They were born Hispanics. It's like the crime of the Palestinians. They made one mistake. They were born in Palestine. So to do that is genocide. So I want to come to my conclusion. The one important step that is necessary, required, and happens in every genocide is racism and xenophobia. Without racism and xenophobia, you have no genocide. To educate people to genocide, you have to have a racist regime, a racist tradition, a racist frame of mind. That is what we now have in most countries in the world. Now, I want to come to Britain because I lived like Raza in Britain. and I've lived in Britain most of my life. And I want to say that basically what we have in Britain now is rampant Islamophobia. And this Islamophobia started actually by Israel in the 60s and 70s, and perfected as a tool against the Palestinians and against other Arabs. Now has been taken by the West, is taken up by the West, and is used against any Muslim whatsoever. I have not much time, so I'll just say this. At the same time that you hear on the news from London or from Britain that Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite, that people like me are anti-Semites, most of the anti-Semites in the Labour Party, so-called, are Jews, like me. We are acting for Palestine, for justice for the Palestinians, for liberation and the rights of Palestinians, and that is why we are called anti-Semites. Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-racist. I know him very well. I know him because he supported Palestine, and he supported black people, he supported Asian people throughout his life. He was an anti-racist when people like Boris Johnson, were spouting racist messages, which he still does. So this anti-racist man, he is the only leader in Britain who has thousands of Jewish friends, is now called anti-Semitic, and actually the whole Tory party, including our so-called Prime Minister, is Islamophobic. So instead of talking about what is happening in Britain, which is very serious Islamophobia, we are being told that the problem is the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Because Britain, America, and Europe have become racist countries who are the main racism in Europe, the main racism in Britain, the main racism in America is no longer, of course not against Jews, but not even against black people. It is basically against Arab and Islamic people, and I think we should recognize this, we should expose it, and we should fight it. Thank you very much.